All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the fifth and final of our Science for Citizens lectures for the spring of 2021. My name is Thomas Miller, and I have the honor and privilege of being the lab director here at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, Chesapeake Biological Lab in Solomons. We bring these Science for Citizens lectures to you twice a year in groups of 5, and we've been doing them now for over a decade. The role of these lectures is to really inform the community about the work that we do and why it's important. And we take great pride in the presentations that we have made and the cutting edge science that we bring to the audience 10 times a year. And we also take great delight in the questions that are asked at the end of every presentation. It never ceases to amaze me, the sharp-eyed questions that we get that challenge our thinking and challenge our understanding. So we thank you for joining us tonight, whether this is your first Science for Citizens lecture or you are a long-time attendee at these events. We welcome you all this evening. Tonight's lecture will be given by one of our own. I will introduce her formally in a minute. If you have questions during her presentation, please type them in the chat box. This is a Zoom conference rather than a Zoom meeting, and as such, you will not be able to unmute or reveal yourself on camera. You'll just be able to type an answer in the question in the chat box, and I will moderate discussion at the end of the presentation. All of these are recorded, and all of the 5 lectures from this season, and in fact, many of our previous lectures are recorded and available on our CBL website. If you just search for Science for Citizens, you'll be taken to each of those videos, and I certainly encourage you to watch some of the earlier presentations as well. So this evening, for our last one in the spring, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lisa Wenger, who is one of our own. Lisa received her PhD from CBL in 1997. She continued to work at CBL as part of an ecological economics group and joined the faculty in 2006 and rose quickly to become a research professor by 2013. Lisa's research focuses broadly on the analysis, the joint analysis of ecological and economic systems to evaluate policy alternatives. Because of that very applied nature of her work, Lisa is sought out by a large number of state and federal organizations to provide help and advice. She has served on the Bay Program Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee from 2007 to 2019, chairing that committee for the last 4 years of her appointment. She serves on the Ecosystem Work Group for the NOAA Scientific Advisory Board. NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and it is the federal agency responsible for coastal policy in the US. And its advisory board is a very high-profile group. And so Lisa's appointment to a technical work group speaks volumes of the level to which she is held in esteem. Most recently, she was appointed to the California Bay Delta Independent Science Review Board, which is a group rather like the Chesapeake Bay program that is charged with using science to help restore the California Bay Delta system, which suffers similar challenges to the Chesapeake Bay, including balancing habitat loss, agricultural practices, climate change, and changes in human use. So Lisa is very well versed in a wide range of ecological and economic questions, and she brings that expertise to bear tonight in a presentation focusing on changing weather, changing farms, opportunities to reduce Chesapeake harm. Lisa, thank you.
Well, thank you, Tom, for that warm up. And I also want to thank Sarah for my very poetic title that she coined. I think it does capture what I'm going to talk about pretty well tonight. I would say that the focus is on adapting to the changing weather that we're already experiencing and are going to experience. You may have heard things in the news about using farmland to reduce the effects of changing weather. This is a complement to that sort of activity. So moving right in, let's see, there we go. So really my story is pretty simple and it's got two themes. And the themes are people can alter the environmental outcomes that are expected with changing weather. A lot of people try to scare you. There's a lot of doom and gloom out there, but I think this talk will have a more hopeful message of the fact that people really are able to adapt and bring about change. And I've got a story there. But the flip side of that is that policies and incentives really need to enable that adaptation and not stand in its way. So before we can talk about solutions, we have to admire the problems for a bit. So I'm going to present, like many complex socio-ecological problems, there are many facets to trying to solve one problem. So I'm going to introduce a bunch of problems and then a solution we think addresses them. Problem one, you're probably familiar with all these problems. We are trying to feed a growing population with a finite amount of land. And we do have a lot of farmland in the Chesapeake Bay, and it's part of this natural resource that's feeding people. It's really odd, there's a delay in forwarding the slides. Did not have this problem before. Okay, so here's one way to look at the problem. Maybe you've seen some charts like this. This is showing various countries around the world and the trajectory of the amount of farmland that's available per person from 1975 to 2005. So each one of those bars is showing you a year. And you see that in every country that's decreasing. So that looks kind of scary. This is one of those doom and gloom slides. How are we going to feed all these people when the farmland per person is decreasing? But here's the flip side of that. When we add human ingenuity, we get a different view of what's happening on farmlands. And this is a summary of what's happening in US farmland. And the blue line here represents total farm output as a reference with 1948. So a number of 2 on this graph says we're producing twice as much food compared to 1948. And what's really important here is the orange line, which is the amount of input that's going in. That's a combination of land, nutrients, labor, machinery. For those have been holding relatively steady and shifting around in proportions, but you see output is really going up. So even though per capita farmland is going down, we have risen to the challenge and we produce a lot of food. Okay, and then that's for the US as a whole, but here locally in Maryland, we see evidence that that holds locally. It does vary spatially, nutrient use efficiency and things like that, but here's some evidence from chicken production. This graph is showing you how much food it takes for a chicken to gain 1 pound, a broiler to gain 1 pound of body weight. And you can see that that has been going down. So that means less feed is producing more chickens, and that's all part of this good trend. But there's always a but, right? The future agricultural production is somewhat more uncertain. Because of changing weather, we're expecting to see stresses to some of our farmland. And that's what this projection is showing. And by the way, I apologize to any colorblind folks in the audience. I didn't create this slide. I know it's not very colorblind friendly, but I'm going to explain it in words. Basically, what this is showing is countries near the equator or closer to the equator are generally expected to see declines in agricultural productivity. And then countries and areas farther from the equator, closer to the poles, are expected to see increases in agricultural productivity due to increases in temperature, changing precipitation patterns. But hopefully, because of what we talked about earlier, you're already a little skeptical. This projection does not include any changes in human behavior, research, anything like that. So it's probably a little more dire than what will actually come to pass. But we do know that in general, we do need to be protective of our farmland because it's going to have this changing productivity. And so Maryland's a little hard to see. I think Maryland is in that red area of the US, but pretty close to the line, which suggests to me that farmland in the Chesapeake is going to be part of the adaptive agriculture that's going to be able to produce more in the future. If we want to get into equity concerns, the picture is a little different. So this graph is from a study that looked at if we wanted to feed everyone a diet that followed the USDA guidelines. We can debate whether that's a perfect diet, but it's a diet that has sufficient calories and sufficient protein for well-being. And what we find is that we don't currently have enough agricultural land to give everyone in the world that diet. And the shortfall is pretty big. So these numbers, these negative numbers here on the left-hand side of this chart show the deficit. And the deficit is 1 gigahectare. And so that's roughly the size of Canada. But we've had this deficit a long time, since the 1980s. So this is not a new thing, but it just speaks to this need that farmland is a scarce resource. Okay, so that's farmland. Farmland, we need farmland to produce food. Problem number 2, changing weather is expected to increase stress on Chesapeake Bay ecosystems. And if any of you have been to prior talks, I'm sure you've heard some of that explained. This chart here from Greenfin Studios looks at precipitation in the Bay region, and between 1910 and 2000, there's already a trend of average increase in precipitation. That's expected to continue. The projections are, under changing weather, we will be experiencing even more precipitation. And from lots of research, we know that more precipitation means higher nutrient loads to the bay, which goes against our pollution diet that we're trying to achieve. And the main problem that we talk about a lot, I'm sure you've heard of the dead zone in the bay. This extra nutrients creates low dissolved oxygen that harms, makes the habitat less useful to fish. They are stressed by low oxygen. By the way, I'm going to talk about oxygen, but it's really dissolved oxygen. So I have to say that, or my ecological colleagues will be upset with me. It's water, it's the oxygen in the water that's the concern, nothing that's going to affect us. But anyway, and this is not a picture of dissolved oxygen problems, but it's a picture of depth that Dr. Jeremy Testa put together, and it's such a lovely graphic, I thought I would show it. It is the deeper areas that tend to have the bigger problems, but shallow waters can also have problems. We don't talk quite as much about that, but that's where things like fish kills come from. You can have very extensive shallow water oxygen problems in the heat of the summer, and that's also very stressful to fish. The other thing is the temperature is increasing. So the USGS has already calculated about a 2% overall air temperature increase since 1960. Stream temperatures are up about 1 degree. That trend is expected to continue. This graphic shows 3 particular years. It doesn't necessarily show a trend, but what it's showing is that seagrass, which is a very important habitat in the bay, can only tolerate so many days of high temperature. And the threshold here is drawn at 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And the idea, what this is intended to show, is that these are daily temperature highs and lows. And any line that goes up into the orange box starts to be a problem for seagrass. It creates metabolic demand. So much like many times you think about wanting to increase your metabolism as a way to lose weight. Well, seagrass don't need to lose weight, but they have to increase their metabolism because of the heat, and they don't necessarily have the right conditions to make up that difference because of the nutrient problem. So we'll get to that in a second, jumping ahead. But anyway, the point is that seagrass are sensitive to warming temperatures, and we're expecting that in the future. Okay, problem 3, this is what I was starting to talk about already, is that combination of changing weather and excess nutrients diminishes the Chesapeake Bay's ability to adapt. So seagrass want to try to migrate to cooler, deeper water because these hot waters can kill them. But the problem is, when they move to cooler, deeper water, they don't get enough light to photosynthesize. And so this picture on the right is what we see. The nutrients create these epiphytes and cloudy water. Epiphytes are plants that grow on plants. And that makes it difficult for them to migrate deeper. And so this is important because I asked naively from the people who study seagrass, I said, why is everyone saying that seagrass is going to die in the bay when you can find the same species of seagrass in North Carolina and Florida? Temperatures warmer down there, why can't our species adapt? And this is what they told me. They told me that those seagrasses that are living south of here are in better flushed water, clearer, deeper water that enables them to persist despite the warming temperatures, at least for now. Okay, so these are all our problems. It's clear that one of the ways we can build some resilience back into the system is by reducing nutrients. So there are many sources of nutrients. Again, I'm thinking this probably isn't news to most of you in the audience. We've already done a lot to reduce nutrients from wastewater treatment plants, from factories, but we still have a lot to do with these non-point sources that come from suburban development and agriculture. And importantly, based on current data from the Chesapeake Bay program, it looks like agriculture is the biggest source of nutrients. Both nitrogen and phosphorus are the nutrients of concern. And the purple sections of these pie charts are natural lands, so we can't do much about those. And so the orange is where we really want to focus a lot of effort, in part because we know some of the cheaper reductions can be had here in agriculture versus in city streets. Not to say that people aren't doing stuff everywhere. They are. We need all the tools in the toolbox to achieve this goal. All right, so I've laid out the problems. We want to feed people on increasingly scarce land. We want to make the system more adaptable to climate change. Here's how an economist approaches the problem. We want to find cost-effective solutions. So this pyramid on the right represents a very general way that we have seen through lots of case studies, a general way to look at the cost effectiveness of pollution control. That generally speaking, if you have something that pollutes, you want to use less is the cheapest thing. That old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The numbers back that up. That is usually the cheapest way to reduce pollution. The next, and then as you work your way down the pyramid, you want to waste less. When it comes to nutrients, you want more of those nutrients to get used in the chickens and in the corn. Then the next option is to transform. So that's usually some form of recycling. I'm going to get to what we're talking about in this case in a minute. Then you have intercepting, this is where riparian buffers and things come in. It's your last chance to remove nutrients from runoff before it hits those water bodies. And then finally, we can remove, using things like oyster aquaculture, we can remove nutrients from the system. So even though this is a general look of cost effectiveness, it doesn't mean you can't find cost-effective options in all of these parts of the pyramid, but this is a general prescription for cost effectiveness. And so when we're trying to find a solution to a problem, we kind of run through this series of questions. We want to find actions that have potential cost effectiveness at a site scale, for example. We want to find when and where they're most cost effective. So we look at where they should be put on the landscape and whether there are timing considerations. And then this is where the kind of modeling that I do comes in. We test whether those successes can be scaled up. Is this really worth doing because enough people are willing to do it? And if everyone who's willing to do it does it, the effect we get is meaningful. It's a meaningful change in the estuary in terms of better fish habitat, better enjoyment of the bay. So this case study I'm about to describe is in this waste less transform part of the pyramid. Okay, the big reveal. This is the practice we're looking at. Drainage control. It's also called conservation drainage. And we're testing whether this is that cost-effective action that we'd like to create an incentive for. The way it works, the protocol for drainage management is that there are already farms that have these drainage controls where they can control how much the land is drained. If you've driven around on Delmarva, you've probably seen these drainage ditches that are out there. There's also subsurface drainage. So first thing the farmer does is they drain it in the spring to allow trafficability. I just learned that word, so I want to use it. That is being able to get your equipment on the land and plant in a dry enough soil. But as soon as you plant, then you raise the water level by using these control structures that are built into the drainage system. That has the environmental benefit of preventing nutrient releases and can also be good for the farmer in terms of increasing yields by reducing drought stress if you can keep water in that root zone. Then after harvesting, you raise the water level even higher, and that is where a lot of the good stuff comes from. You're preventing release of nutrients, and you're also promoting denitrification. That's a fancy word for taking nitrogen out of the system. When soils are saturated, microbes get to work on the nitrogen, and they end up turning the nitrogen into a gas, and our atmosphere is predominantly nitrogen gas, so effectively it gets removed from the system. And there's a small benefit to the farmer in terms of soil saturation, can be useful when he's for the next planting. Okay, so now running down that list, so we've looked at something that might be cost effective. There's already drainage existing, so that looks good. How much can it work to solve our problems? The next thing is, where would reductions matter the most? Here's an analysis that was done by the USGS, the US Geological Survey. They have monitoring stations all throughout the bay that let them track water quality over time. And it's been running since about 2009, and they're able to tell us now which areas have increased nutrient loads and which are decreasing their nutrient loads. And the blue circles represent decreases in nitrogen, and the orange circles are increases, and the bigger the circle, the bigger the change. So on the Delmarva Peninsula, which is where our case study is, you can see that things are not necessarily moving in the right direction. So this is the area we've targeted, and that's where the drainage management is. So we've picked an area that looks cost effective, and then there's the when question. So this takes a little explaining. We have to start thinking about phenology, which is just a fancy word for seasonality. Maybe you've heard of it, that there are people who track when flowers first come out or when buds first form on trees. So here's a nice picture of a red bud. We've all just experienced this lovely spring and seen our red buds come out. And this map on the right is from this year, nice current data, showing that we did have a little bit of an early spring for us based on red bud dates. And the orange and the yellow represent something that's a little earlier than the long-term average. So this is phenology, as you might have heard of it already, but the Bay also has phenology. What we've learned, and in large part due to researchers here at CBL and Horn Point 2, who've been studying these effects over long periods of time, they have discovered that spring nutrients have a disproportionate effect on the summer anoxia, the low oxygen dead zone that we get in the middle of summer when temperatures are high. And so this picture here is just a kind of cartoon of, nutrient loads tend to peak in the spring, and that's partly related to agricultural planting, but also just extra rain we get in the spring. That comes as temperatures are warming up, and that sets up conditions that, you get this big algae bloom in the spring, but there aren't a lot of things around to eat the algae, so it settles to the bottom and starts, as it decomposes, it uses up oxygen and sets up this high hypoxia. So that's what that red peak is showing you here in this graphic. You get this big dead zone in the summer. But what if we could shift those nutrients around in time? If we've discovered through our modeling that if the nutrients came a little bit earlier, when the water was a little bit cooler, that tends to reduce that hypoxic peak, that the low oxygen, the dead zone is smaller when we do that. So we're using that information too to think about how could we design this practice to be most effective. So using that phenology, we imagine a policy, and this isn't really that different from what a lot of people are already implementing and testing, is that we'd create an incentive for early planting and using drainage management to reduce nutrient flows. So that does create a little bit of a risk that early planting can result sometimes in a flooded field, such as I'm showing here, where you get later spring rains that may damage your yields. They can stunt the crop or kill the crop. But under a new policy, one could ensure that crop damage, and basically we'd be renting a wetland, as it were. The farmer, we're encouraging the farmer to plant as early as possible if the weather permits. There can be weather challenges. And that helps us move that nitrogen further back. They drain the land earlier, they plant earlier, the nutrients go into the system earlier when they have less effect on the habitat quality. So that's the basic idea. Now, we have to figure out if farmers would like to do this with us, like to do this experiment with us. And one of the things that gives us hope that they would is that early planting improves corn and soy yields in general. So on average, this graphic here is for Illinois, but you would find the exact same relationship in the mid-Atlantic. This was the best looking diagram I could find. And so this is a win-win. We're encouraging them to plant early. As long as we were covering the risk for adverse weather conditions, they're going to see an increase in return if they did that every year on average. So, and also that's a good time to mention, farmers are already planting earlier. On average, someone in our research group showed they've already started planting 2 weeks earlier compared to 1980. So farmers are already on it. And we have developed an economic model. I'm just sort of proving to you that we can do math. We take a look at the landscape. We look at different farm characteristics. We look at the soil type. We look at what crops they're growing. And we look at how many farms would be available to adopt this and how it might affect their profits, because we do care that the farms stay profitable. And then we also look at the cost. Is this really a good way to reduce nutrients? Well, we started out thinking there's already drainage management there, so we're using existing structures. That suggests it should be inexpensive. What we've since learned is that the existing drainage isn't really optimal for doing this practice. And that means that maybe some farms might have to flood part of their field in order to make this work. That's not ideal, but again, if we compensate them for those losses, maybe they would partner with us. There are groups such as Shore Rivers has a plan to put in new optimized drainage. They use tile drains, which is in the subsurface, and they're already trying to incentivize this practice. That is fairly expensive to put in this drainage, but they say they have a favorable cost per pound removed. So that's also something to think about. Just because it's cheap doesn't mean it's the best way to do it. And then the thing that I wish I didn't have to talk about, but I do, is that phosphorus can sometimes be mobilized through this practice. That means phosphorus can dissolve and it can move out of the system, which we don't want it to do. Normally phosphorus stays attached to particles, but when you saturate the land, it can become more mobile. But there are people working on ways to adapt this practice so that the phosphorus doesn't get released. Some of them are fairly simple, like just trying to capture the sediments, and then they can even dredge them and put them back on the cropland. Some are more complicated using chemical processes. They do add costs. All right, so using all that information, which really took a long time to gather, we put together this modeling suite to do the final test. So now we're testing, is this worth trying to scale up? So we have a model of how farmers make decisions. So we introduce this policy, we see who's likely to adopt it. We build a watershed model that tells us if those farmers make those choices, and also we bring in all this background information about how land use is changing, how the weather's changing, we put in the variability in the system, and we say, okay, what happens to the nutrients on the land? How much gets put into the bay? And then we put it into the estuarine model, which Dr. Jeremy Testa runs, and he tells us if that improved the habitats. We're not just looking at nutrient loads, we're also looking at habitat, but we do want to know how much nutrients went into the streams, because that can be important. And then the farmer choice model tells us what the profitability of the farms is, and also what the policy cost us in terms of having to compensate for lost yields. So these are preliminary results. Please do not quote these. But in terms of what we're finding, we find this practice is very effective at reducing edge of farm nutrients. On average, it's 30%, but it can get much higher. And some of that data comes from real experimental research on the Eastern Shore. This isn't just crazy modeling talk. This has been demonstrated in the field. The annual load to the estuary appears to only be about 5%. We're still looking at that number. It could go up, but because not every farmer is adopting, and some of those nutrients never would have made it to the bay anyway, we only see about a 5% drop in the nitrogen load to the estuary. And then we exaggerated the timing just a bit. We shifted the timing a whole month earlier, which may be realistic in a future climate. And what Dr. Testa has found so far, again, preliminary results, is about a 5 to 10% increase in normal oxygen conditions. So that's 5 to 10% more habitat area that's good for fish. So now we have to compare that to the cost and see if that was worth paying for, if that was a good use of this effort. And what we do see is that this habitat benefit persists across weather conditions. So I know this graphic is a little hard to follow, but basically what the thing to look at, if you look at the left-hand graph, there's a dashed gray line that goes straight across. The area between the dashed gray line and the black line is how much more normal oxygen was on that day compared to not having done the drainage management. So the lower that black line, the more good habitat we have. And you see that it worked in an average year, it worked in a dry year, and it worked particularly well in a wet year, which is, as we know, wet years tend to be the times when habitat suffers the most. So one of the things we've been thinking about is that maybe we only do this incentive during wet years to really prevent the worst problems. So that would be another way to make it potentially more cost effective. And these results are from a student, Nicole Bassenbach, under the direction of Dr. Testa and his postdoc, Dr. Shen. Okay, so summing up the research results, what we're saying is that what farmers are already doing, shifting planting earlier, is likely to be improving Chesapeake Bay habitat already by getting the nutrients in the water before it's warm enough to really create as big an algae bloom. If we add on to that the ability to time and further reduce nutrient flows, it has the potential to multiply the benefits. And that's what this graphic on the right-hand side is saying. Again, these are hypothetical results, don't quote me yet, but we will eventually have results like this, where what we're saying is that if you just do early planning, you don't even do the drainage management, you're already going to have some benefits in terms of reduced, well, you may or may not have reduced cost per or benefits per nitrogen reduced. You might just break even there. And so this is a benefit cost ratio. So you want to be above 1, ideally, to say that I got more benefits than it cost me to implement this policy. So what this graphic shows is that if we measure benefits just in terms of nitrogen loads, we're not going to see much difference. But if we measure benefits in terms of habitat improvements, we see a big difference. So it's not really just about loads, it's also about how much did those loads affect the bay because of this phenology effect. And then if we can also reduce the loads through the drainage management, we can magnify that effect. And it really shows the power of these integrated models. We've got the economic model showing farmer behavior. We've got the ecological models representing all the stresses and forces on the system. It's a way to combine all our knowledge to show whether this is really going to pay off. Okay, so that's my big sell on the modeling. Now let me talk about some bigger picture conclusions. So I think this is not unique to this particular situation, that people's behavior is already adapting to changing weather, and that those changes can reduce or they can increase harms compared to changing weather alone. And I think, you know, if you leave here with nothing else, I hope you'll be a little bit more skeptical about these doom and gloom things where people assume no change in human behavior, but only the weather stress, and then they show you a lot of very bad changes. But people are very adaptable, they're very innovative, and it's always important to remember that people have the ability to alter those outcomes. But we do sometimes need incentives. You know, people may not find these solutions on their own. You know, they're like, for example, farmers are just trying to run their farms. They're not trying to solve all the environmental problems. So we use these incentives as a way to reflect this broader social concerns into their operation. You know, we're sharing the risk with them and helping them help everyone. And I think if we work with farmers, you know, this is based on some other research that I'm doing with my postdoc, Dan Reed. A lot of farmers are very focused on production. They're running a business, they're trying to make money. And even though a lot of farmers have environmental goals, there's a big proportion of farmers that are primarily motivated by making sure they're producing as much food as possible. They're doing their part to feed the world. And we really need to think about incentives for them, not simply leaning on them to take hits in their production so they can help the Bay, because it is important to preserve the agricultural land. And you know, this is a case study where we're finding solutions that meet multiple goals, and that can be an effective way to engage participants who have distinct goals. And in terms of Bay restoration, this is also something I've been working on for quite some time. We've gotten very focused on the nitrogen and phosphorus goals and the sediment goals, but now that the cost of doing those reductions is getting more expensive. We've done a lot of the inexpensive stuff, and getting additional reductions is getting more and more expensive. It's time to start thinking about these location and timing effects as a way to save money. So we showed that moving the nutrients up in time was enough to improve habitat quality. So it's not always just about the total pounds going into the Bay. It's also sometimes about where and when they're delivered. And if we think in terms of habitat benefits, we may see these opportunities to save money. So those are the big picture conclusions. There were many contributors to this analysis, and also many folks helping us share the information we learned with school children. We developed a simulation game that lets you be a farmer and make choices about what management practices you're going to implement. And we had teachers collaborating with us, and we had many modelers who looked deeply at these systems to put this story together. So I thank you, and I'm now open to your questions.
Thank you, Lisa. And it's somewhat poignant to see Michael Kemp's name up on that list, a really valued colleague who we lost last year. So let me go through the questions, and we'll see what we can do. So a name you might recognize, I assume it's the same Bill Ball that we both know. On the food output versus time graph, I'm wondering how this looks in terms of food per capita. So you showed food going down over time. During part of that food per acre going down is because the human population is expanding. So across the different nations, are other nations keeping pace with their sort of production?
Yes, so those production gains are, sorry, it takes a while to get back with all this animation. So here's the graphic we're talking about. And here's what the US is doing. Yes, this is largely reflected in other countries as well, but it's not uniform. And it's also not uniform around the US. You know, we still have actually a little ways to go in the Bay in terms of increasing our total factor productivity to be equivalent to this US average, for example. But this is partly the Green Revolution. This is partly, you know, hybrids that are available globally. There are rural agricultural systems that are not taking up these practices. And I'm not going to weigh in on whether that's appropriate or not. It's a complex question.
Okay. So the next question from Jack Templeton, and he asks, are adequate incentives in place to encourage the planting of agricultural stream buffers to fence off streams from cattle, to prevent manure pits from tainting groundwater? What more could be done if not adequate?
I think what we're finding, so there's a lot of people, a lot of boots on the ground, talking to farmers, trying to encourage them to put in these types of practices. And we've had, Maryland is one of the top states for putting in things like cover crops. We're doing pretty well on stream fencing, in part thanks to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's work, cost sharing that with farmers. But things like buffers are not going as well. And I think, you know, this talk speaks to that in the sense of stream buffers take land out of production. Depending on how wide they are, depending on how good that land is, that can be a significant hit to the farmer in terms of his yield. So, and there are other reasons why farmers may or may not want to put stream buffers in. Some are doing it because they like seeing the birds, they like hunting, they have other benefits they get. But there are these kind of production-oriented farmers who are not necessarily inclined to do that. And it may be a hard sell. You know, some of the incentives are there. I mean, we're actually testing, my postdoc and I, Dan Reed, are testing whether it's just a matter of there isn't enough cost sharing money, there are not enough technical assistance providers. It could be that more farmers are willing to do it and we just haven't reached them. But it could also be that this is a tough sell. And so we're testing that effect right now.
Okay, thank you. Nicole Phelps refers to a graph you showed in the presentation, the distribution of nutrient loads. There were two pie charts where ag was the main contributor. And Nicole asks, what was the definition of natural in these systems? So the purple color, what do those refer to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would actually have to double check to make sure, but I'm pretty sure it's forests and natural grasslands and shrublands and wetlands. It is possible it includes working forests. That's the category. I'm not sure if that would have gone into natural or agricultural. But it's generally going to be what we think of as natural land cover, trees and shrubs and wetlands and things.
Okay.
Were you, maybe she was surprised that so much nitrogen and phosphorus were coming from those lands.
Natural systems, yeah. I think that probably was behind the question. We'll see if Nicole types in something to confirm it.
Well, I'll just preemptively say, you know, a lot of nutrients do just leak out of natural systems, especially older forests. So it's not unexpected. Some of the phosphorus is probably coming from stream bank erosion and things like that, where it's not really anyone's personal fault. It's just that hydrology has changed and a lot of stream banks are eroding, and that's where a lot of the phosphorus is apparently coming from.
So Jim Shepherd asks, the warming of the climate, which is encouraging earlier planting, which we think might lead to improvements in the bay, but won't the increase in water temperature erase any improvements in hypoxia, just because warmer water holds less oxygen?
It's a good question. I mean, Dr. Testa's model does take that into account. So he put in warming and the change in timing, and it suggests that it doesn't completely counteract it, that it really is that the nutrients are driving that algal bloom that's driving the hypoxia. But I think we do have some more digging to do there. And you'll have to probably wait a few more months before we have the final answer. But apparently there's enough capacity to absorb some of that temperature change. Now, that doesn't mean the seagrass are going to be happy. It's not the low oxygen for them as much as it is the nutrients and the temperature. So.
Okay, thank you. Paul Dennett notes that farmers are already planting their crops earlier in our region. Why is that? Is it in response to the warming of the climate, or have they in fact found what that graph showed from Illinois, I think it was, that earlier planting leads to higher production independent of climate change?
Yeah, I really wish I knew more about this. I think just in general, farmers know getting the crop in early is to their advantage. And so, and they've probably just learned over time that the frosts aren't coming as frequently, that the risks are lower. So I just happened to read about a farmer this weekend who basically uses the natural system to indicate to him when he should plant. I don't know how many farmers follow this kind of decision rule, but he's looking at the red buds, he's looking at the phenology, and he's saying, yeah, this year I'm going to plant early because I'm seeing what the trees are doing. So I don't really know the answer to that. We have to ask some farmers, but it suggests that they're just picking up on signals that tell them it's better to plant earlier.
Okay. So this is from Rob Schnabel, who says agriculture of today has shifted to monocultures that require high inputs and nutrients. Soil health is a dual solution, water quality and climate change, and makes farms more resilient. I'm not quite sure I fully understand that sentence, but that may just be me. And that too many Band-Aids, Rob would argue, too many BMPs, Rod would argue, are Band-Aids not really getting at the heart of the question. So could you run your model on the 5 soil health principles, practices like multi-species grazing, overseeding, multi-species cover crops, and roller crimping? I don't know what the last.
I get the question. You know, this is actually, we've heard a lot in the news about this lately. You know, the Biden administration has talked about paying farmers to get more carbon in the soil, and that happens through some of those kinds of practices. But the models really depend on field research. And so we don't just, I mean, we can just make up stuff in models, but we try not to. We try to use evidence from the field, you know, really demonstrated relationships before we can model them. And we also have a limited ability to show things that aren't happening on that many acres. So though doing exactly what you say would be challenging. It would require making many changes to the model, but also, unfortunately, we don't really have quite enough research to show the benefits of some of these practices. I think we're kind of taking it on faith right now that we generally know soils with more carbon tend to perform better in a lot of ways, including drought resistance, but really showing that adopting these practices, if your soil has already been diminished and you adopt these practices, unfortunately, we don't have really, really strong evidence yet that you start seeing an immediate return. And so this is kind of the problem, but a lot of farmers are just willing to take it on faith that it will eventually pay off, and they're doing it anyway. So that's part of why we still need incentives for some of these things. I hope that answered the question. Type another one if I didn't answer that.
I think so. I'll also ask Aaron Wendt to type in a question. He asked you to go back to the slide before the big picture conclusions, but I'm not quite sure whether there was something he was particularly looking for on that slide or what. And while we're waiting for Aaron to reply, Rob asked you the question about the 5 soil health principles. He typed in response, thanking you for your answer and saying, Maryland's 1 million acre challenge is focusing on soil health. and would welcome working with you and the team, I assume. And Aaron says, no question, just didn't absorb it all. So Lisa, I have one question, and this is moderator's privilege here. The team you listed at the end was a really multidisciplinary team. It wasn't just an interdisciplinary team. This was multiple intellectual traditions coming together to address a challenging question. So I wonder whether you could talk just briefly of the benefits of that team science, multidisciplinary team science, and perhaps also some of the challenges of working in such an environment.
Somehow it's easier to think of the challenges, but let's start with the positive. Well, first of all, I'm very passionate about the idea. You may have noticed this. I'm very passionate about the idea that we can't ignore human behavior, that we're just going to miss the boat if we're only looking at the physiological changes, the biophysical changes, the chemical changes. It's not enough. People are a big component of the system. And yet this kind of integrated modeling where you're trying to solve a problem just doesn't happen all that often, partly because it's hard and it takes a lot of people working together. But it really is great that we were able to put together a team. So my economist colleague who did a lot of the farm modeling, Ariel Ortiz-Bobier, if you Google him, you'll find he's in the news a lot talking about how farmers are adapting to climate change. And it was just great to have someone who really specializes in that, creating that model. This is what the NSF funding really enables us to do, is you get like the best person who looks at farmer response to changing weather. You get some of the best people who are studying how to model the watershed. Kieran Harmon at Johns Hopkins is a real up and coming hydrology professor there. And then we have Dr. Jeremy Testa, who is just practically underwrites the whole Chesapeake Bay program in terms of helping them deepen their understanding of how the system responds so that they can better manage it. It's really just great to be able to get these super knowledgeable people to come together, and then as an economist I have to kind of mesh all the pieces together, and that this can be challenging because people sometimes just want to work in their little corner, and I have to keep pulling them out of their corner and say, but here's my question. You wanted to work on that question, but here's my question. So it's part of the reason why a lot of people avoid these kinds of collaborations, because in terms of the amount of time you get to spend just doing what your colleagues think is the most important thing is less. But the benefit is you can say more about how society needs to respond, and you give managers useful information about how to target their efforts. So there's trade-offs, like everything, there are trade-offs.
I think that's a phrase I associate with you and your colleagues with economics. It's that it depends and there are trade-offs. So I will finish with one question from Lillian Hart, thanking you for the presentation, and asking if there are any suggested readings or suggested entry points you could give for integrated ecosystem assessment and modeling. So it may be something that we ask Lillian to contact Sarah for, and you provide perhaps more targeted examples. But if there is anything in general that you could think of that would be a good place to start.
Yes, I will have to think about that. And of course, it kind of depends on the problem in terms of I could show you an example that's, directly related to an issue you're interested in, or we could try to figure out who's written really well about this kind of modeling. You can wait for our paper to come out, probably in about a year. But yeah, that is tough. I'm not sure a lot of the papers are very accessible is one problem I'm thinking of. They get really technical really fast, but I'll think about it. And we'll try to maybe post something with the talk or something like that.
We do tend to hide them behind academic paywalls, I'm afraid. Sarah has put her email address in the chat box for anyone who wants to follow up. I want to thank Lisa for a wonderful presentation to end our spring season. Lisa, thank you very, very much indeed. I want to thank all of you who have attended this session and for this season. It has been a different experience for us to do these all virtually. It has meant that we've missed the sense of community that we have from welcoming people onto the CBL campus of a Tuesday evening. But we celebrate the fact that we have also been able to reach a very different audience, an extended audience through this medium. We are hoping that we will be back to normal operations in the autumn. The current plan for the university system is to be returning to campus. Whether that involves welcoming visitors onto our campuses obviously remains to be seen. It's too early to tell. But I do think the virtual nature of this session has been sufficiently positive for us that we will continue doing some element of this in the virtual space. We may well have the capacity, in fact, we do have the capacity to live stream and have people in the audience. And so I think we will look to be doing that in September. For those of you who put your name on our mailing list, you will expect to see information from us early to mid-summer with the topics for the September session. We typically start our Science for Citizens series in September and run them through October. And we'll do another 5 presentations. And I just want to thank all of you who have attended tonight for investing an hour of your time with us. And I wish you all a very pleasant spring evening and a great summer, hoping that we get to share a lot more community than we have done for the last year or so. And Lisa, once again, thank you very much indeed.
And thank you to all who listened. Thanks for joining in.